I sat perfectly still, watching the HR director avoid my gaze. Behind her, through the transparent glass wall, I could see the warehouses packed with inventory, the perfect result of my 15 years of flawless forecasting. But this time, my gut told me everything was about to change dramatically. We've decided to optimize our operations, so your position will be eliminated, Sandra Powell said, her voice carefully neutral as she delivered the news that would upend my world. My name is Michael Russo, and at 51, I had spent the better part of my adult life as the senior inventory forecasting specialist for Clearfield Distributors, a major retail distribution company based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For 15 years, I had been the invisible architect behind the company's supply chain success, the person who ensured our warehouses held exactly what we needed, when we needed it, without excess waste or costly shortages. The irony wasn't lost on me. Through those glass walls, I could see the fruits of my labor, warehouses operating at optimal capacity, inventory levels that had helped Clearfield weather two major economic downturns while our competitors struggled with overstock or stockouts. My forecasting system had become the backbone of our operations, a complex but reliable method that had saved the company millions in carrying costs and lost sales. I understand, I said quietly, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. Who will be taking over my responsibilities? Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Lucas Davenport will be transitioning into the role. He's our new vice president of operations, recently transferred from our parent company after the merger. He has an MBA from Wharton and extensive experience in modern supply chain management. Lucas Davenport, I knew the name well. At 35, he was everything corporate America seemed to value these days: young, energetic, armed with an impressive educational pedigree and full of confidence in what he called contemporary forecasting methodologies. He had arrived 6 months ago as part of the corporate restructuring that followed Clearfield's acquisition by a larger conglomerate. And from day one, he had made it clear that he viewed my methods as outdated. I had built my forecasting system the old-fashioned way, through years of careful observation, data analysis, and an intuitive understanding of market patterns that came only from experience. It wasn't flashy, didn't rely on the latest software trends or social media analytics, but it worked. For 15 years, it had worked flawlessly. Lucas, on the other hand, was a true believer in what he called dynamic market prediction through social sentiment analysis and algorithmic trend forecasting. He spoke in buzzwords and PowerPoint presentations, advocating for systems that would incorporate Twitter feeds, Instagram trends, and TikTok analytics into our inventory decisions. When I had respectfully suggested that social media metrics might not be the most reliable indicator for wholesale distribution to traditional retailers, he had smiled condescendingly and suggested I might benefit from some contemporary business methodology training. As I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, I thought about Anna, my wife of 22 years, who had passed away from heart complications 4 years earlier. Work had become my refuge after her death, the one place where I felt competent and needed. The forecasting models I had developed weren't just spreadsheets to me, they were a representation of everything I had learned about business, about patterns, about the careful balance between supply and demand that kept companies profitable. Anna had always been proud of my work, even if she never fully understood it. "You see things other people don't," she used to say when I would explain how I could predict seasonal fluctuations or anticipate market shifts months in advance. "You have a gift for seeing the big picture." Now, sitting in my empty office for the last time, I wondered if that gift had become obsolete in a world that valued algorithms over experience. The transition period was brief. Lucas had made it clear that he wanted to implement his new systems as quickly as possible. He had little interest in learning about my methods, dismissing them as legacy processes that were holding the company back. When I offered to spend a few weeks training him on the nuances of our client base and seasonal patterns, he politely declined, explaining that his new analytical tools would quickly identify any patterns worth preserving. I left behind detailed documentation of my forecasting methods, including the comprehensive seasonal analysis I had completed just weeks before my termination. based on historical data, customer feedback, and careful market analysis. I had projected that demand for electronics and home furnishings would decrease by approximately 30% in the coming quarter due to a combination of economic uncertainty and changing consumer spending patterns. My recommendation had been to reduce orders accordingly, particularly for high-ticket items that might sit in inventory for extended periods. The documentation was thorough, 47 pages of analysis, charts, and recommendations that represented not just my final project at Clearfield, but the accumulation of everything I had learned about predicting market behavior. I placed it prominently on Lucas's desk with a note explaining its importance, hoping that even if he planned to implement new methods, he might at least consider my analysis for the immediate term. 6 months passed quietly. I had taken a consulting position with a smaller distributor across town, helping them optimize their inventory management. The work was satisfying, if less challenging than what I had done at Clearfield. My new employer was grateful for my expertise and implemented my recommendations without question. Seeing immediate improvements in their inventory turnover rates, I tried not to think about Clearfield, though I occasionally heard updates through former colleagues. Emma Harper, who had been my assistant for 3 years, still worked there and would sometimes mention how different things had become under Lucas's management. She was careful not to be overly critical. She needed her job, but I could read between the lines of her carefully worded updates. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late March, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Michael, this is Richard Malloy. I need to ask you about the forecast you left when you transitioned out." Richard Malloy was Clearfield's CEO, a man I had worked with for over a decade, but who had been largely absent from the day-to-day operations since the merger. His voice carried a tension I had never heard before. "Of course, Mr. Malloy, which specific aspect did you want to discuss?" There was a long pause before he answered. "All of it. Michael, we need to talk about all of it. Can you come in this afternoon?" The Clearfield offices looked the same, but something felt different as I walked through the familiar hallways. There was a tension in the air, a sense of controlled urgency that hadn't been there when I left. Sandra Powell greeted me with an expression that was far more deferential than it had been during our last meeting. Richard's office was on the top floor, overlooking the warehouse complex that had once been my domain. As I entered, I could see immediately that something was seriously wrong. The warehouses that should have been operating at optimal capacity were clearly overcrowded. With inventory spilling into areas that should have been clear for operational flow. "Michael, I'm going to be direct with you," Richard said, gesturing for me to sit across from his desk. "We're sitting on $5 million in excess inventory, and we're simultaneously facing stockouts on items our major clients desperately need. Lucas's forecasting has been a disaster, and I've just discovered that he never reviewed the analysis you left behind." The story that emerged over the next hour was exactly what I had feared might happen, but worse than I had imagined. Lucas had not only ignored my final forecast, but had actively decided to do the opposite of my recommendations. Where I had suggested reducing orders for electronics and home furnishings by 30%, he had doubled them, convinced that his social media analytics indicated a surge in demand. His reasoning, Richard explained, was based on what he called social engagement trending and influencer-driven demand prediction. Lucas had identified several TikTok personalities who were featuring electronics and home decor items, and his algorithms had suggested this would translate into massive B2B demand for wholesale distribution. He had dismissed my recommendations as overly conservative and disconnected from digital consumer behavior. The results were catastrophic. Clearfield's warehouses were now packed with high-end electronics and furniture that weren't moving, while they were completely out of basic household items, office supplies, and seasonal goods that their retail clients actually needed. Major customers were threatening to cancel contracts due to persistent stockouts, while the company was hemorrhaging money on carrying costs for inventory that was depreciating by the day. But that's not the worst part. Richard continued, his frustration evident. "I've discovered that Lucas didn't just ignore your forecast. He actively prevented others from accessing it. When Emma tried to raise concerns about his ordering decisions, he reprimanded her for undermining new strategic initiatives." When Ben Carter at our Cleveland warehouse questioned why they were receiving so much high-end inventory when their retail clients were asking for basic goods, Lucas told him to focus on warehousing, not strategy. Ben Carter had been a warehouse manager for 8 years, someone whose practical understanding of customer needs had always been invaluable to my forecasting process. The fact that Lucas had dismissed his concerns revealed a dangerous disconnect between management decisions and operational reality. Over the following days, I conducted my own investigation, reaching out to former colleagues who were still with the company. The picture that emerged was even more troubling than Richard had initially described. Emma Harper, my former assistant, was finally able to speak freely about what had happened after my departure. Lucas had not only ignored my forecast, but had actually removed it from the shared drive system, claiming it was legacy documentation that might confuse staff members who were transitioning to new methodologies. When Emma had tried to access the files to double-check some of the seasonal projections, she found they had been archived in a location that required special permission to access. I tried to warn him. "Michael," Emma told me during a coffee meeting, "when I saw the orders he was placing, I knew something was wrong. I pulled up your historical data and showed him the patterns from previous years, but he said I was being resistant to change. He actually wrote me up for insubordination when I suggested he might want to reconsider the volume of electronics orders." The situation at the warehouses was even worse than what I could see from Richard's office windows. Ben Carter, when I called him directly, painted a picture of operational chaos. "Michael, I've never seen anything like it," Ben said, his voice carrying the frustration of a man who took pride in running an efficient operation. "We've got pallets of $2,000 smart TVs stacked to the ceiling while our biggest retail client has been waiting 3 weeks for basic kitchen appliances." When I tried to explain to Lucas that our customers weren't asking for luxury electronics, he told me I didn't understand market disruption dynamics. Ben went on to explain that Lucas had implemented new inventory management protocols that prevented warehouse managers from communicating directly with purchasing decisions. Previously, managers like Ben had been crucial sources of real-time market intelligence, providing feedback about what customers were actually ordering versus what corporate forecasts predicted they would need. Lucas had eliminated this feedback loop, claiming it introduced too much subjective bias into what should be purely data-driven decisions. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Lucas hadn't just made poor forecasting decisions. He had systematically dismantled the information networks that had made accurate forecasting possible in the first place. After a week of investigation, Richard asked me to present my findings to the company's board of directors. It was an opportunity I had never expected and one that would require me to do something I had never been comfortable with: openly criticize a colleague's work in front of senior leadership. I spent the entire weekend preparing for the presentation, organizing my findings into 3 main areas. First, I would explain the forecasting methodology I had developed over 15 years and why it had been successful. Second, I would provide a detailed comparison between my recommendations and Lucas's decisions, showing exactly where and why things had gone wrong. Third, I would present the evidence I had gathered from warehouse managers and staff about the real-world impact of these decisions. The presentation was scheduled for Tuesday morning in the company's main conference room. As I set up my materials, I noticed Lucas entering with his own laptop and a stack of documents. He looked confident, almost defiant, as if he was prepared to defend his decisions against what he clearly viewed as an attack from the past. Richard introduced me to the board members, most of whom I had never met despite 15 years with the company. They were the kind of executives who dealt in quarterly reports and strategic initiatives rather than the day-to-day realities of inventory management. I realized that my presentation would need to translate operational details into language that resonated with their focus on financial performance and risk management. I began by explaining the forecasting system I had developed, emphasizing not the methodology itself, but the results it had produced. Over 15 years, my forecasts had maintained an accuracy rate of over 92%, had helped Clearfield avoid major inventory write-offs during 2 economic downturns, and had consistently kept inventory turnover rates above industry averages. I showed charts demonstrating how the company's inventory carrying costs had decreased year over year under my system, while customer satisfaction scores had remained consistently high. Then I moved to the current situation. Using side-by-side comparisons, I showed exactly how my final forecast had differed from Lucas's decisions, where I had predicted decreased demand for electronics and recommended reducing orders by 30%. Lucas had increased them by 200%, where I had identified increased demand for basic household goods and seasonal items. Lucas had reduced those orders by 40%, believing they were low-engagement products that wouldn't benefit from social media-driven trends. The financial impact was stark. The excess electronics inventory was not only tying up $5 million in capital, but was also depreciating in value as newer models were released. Meanwhile, stockouts on high turnover items had resulted in canceled orders worth an estimated $2 million, with several major clients threatening to switch to competitors. But the most powerful part of my presentation came when I connected via video call to 3 of our warehouse managers, including Ben Carter. One by one, they described the operational chaos they were experiencing: warehouses packed with inventory that wasn't moving, frustrated retail clients who couldn't get basic products they needed, and the complete breakdown in communication between warehouse operations and corporate purchasing decisions. Ben Carter's testimony was particularly compelling. He had managed warehouses for 8 years and had never seen such a disconnect between inventory and customer demand. Mr. Russo's forecasts weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. He told the board, they reflected what we were actually seeing on the ground, what our customers were actually ordering. Now we're trying to sell luxury electronics to retailers whose customers are looking for affordable basics. Throughout my presentation, Lucas had been taking notes and occasionally shaking his head. When I finished, Richard invited him to respond. Lucas stood confidently and launched into a defense of his methodology that was heavy on business school terminology, but light on actual results. He claimed the inventory problems were temporary growing pains as the market adapted to digital native consumer behavior patterns. He insisted that his social media analytics had correctly identified emerging trends, but that traditional retail channels were simply slow to recognize and respond to these trends. The fundamental issue, Lucas said, looking directly at me, is that legacy forecasting methods are inherently reactive rather than predictive. They look at what happened in the past rather than anticipating what will happen in the future. My methodology is designed to identify emerging consumer preferences before they show up in traditional sales data. He presented charts showing social media engagement rates for various product categories, explaining how his algorithms had identified increased online discussion about electronics and home furnishings. The problem, he argued, wasn't with his forecasting, but with Clearfield's retail clients, who weren't sophisticated enough to recognize and capitalize on emerging trends. It was a polished presentation full of confidence and contemporary business language, but as Lucas spoke, I noticed the board members asking increasingly pointed questions about actual results. When one director asked for specific examples of how his social media analytics had translated into increased sales, Lucas's answers became vague, focusing on long-term market positioning rather than immediate financial performance. The turning point came when board member Patricia Williams asked Lucas directly about my forecast and why he had chosen not to consider it. I reviewed Michael's documentation, Lucas said, but it represented exactly the kind of backward-looking analysis that prevents companies from adapting to changing markets. His recommendations would have positioned us for last year's economy rather than next year's opportunities. Patricia looked puzzled. But according to the financial reports, his backward-looking analysis would have prevented $5 million in excess inventory and $2 million in lost sales. Can you explain how that represents poor positioning? Lucas's response was telling. He began talking about strategic patience and investment in future market position, but couldn't provide any concrete timeline for when the current inventory would move, or when the social media trends he had identified would translate into actual wholesale demand. The questions from the board became more direct and more challenging. When asked specifically about the communication breakdown with warehouse managers, Lucas defended his decision to centralize forecasting decisions, claiming it eliminated bias and improved strategic consistency. When pressed about employee concerns and customer complaints, He suggested these were natural resistance to change that would resolve as people adapted to more sophisticated business processes. It became clear that Lucas genuinely believed his methodology was superior, but he had no concrete evidence that it was actually working. His confidence was impressive, but it wasn't backed by results. The meeting concluded with the board requesting time to deliberate. Lucas left first, still projecting confidence but with less of the defiant energy he had shown earlier. As I packed up my materials, Richard approached me privately. "Michael, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If we offered you Lucas's position, would you be interested?" The question caught me off guard. When I had been let go 6 months earlier, I had assumed that chapter of my career was permanently closed. The idea of returning, particularly in a more senior role, was both appealing and daunting. I would need to understand what authority I would have, I said carefully. The problems here go beyond just forecasting methodology. The entire information flow between operations and management needs to be rebuilt. Richard nodded. That's exactly what we need. Someone who understands that inventory management isn't just about data analysis, but about understanding the entire ecosystem of suppliers, customers, and market conditions. 2 days later, Richard called with the board's decision. Lucas had been terminated immediately, and they were offering me the position of Vice President of Operations with full authority over inventory forecasting, purchasing decisions, and warehouse coordination. It was a significant promotion from my previous role, with a salary increase and, more importantly, the authority to rebuild the systems that had been dismantled. I asked for 2 weeks to consider the offer. During that time, I thought carefully about what I would be taking on. Returning to Clearfield would mean inheriting a $5 million inventory problem, rebuilding damaged relationships with major clients, and reconstructing information systems that had taken years to develop originally. It would also mean working to undo 6 months of operational chaos while simultaneously preventing further problems. But it also represented an opportunity to prove that experience and careful analysis could still compete with flashy new methodologies. More than that, it was a chance to restore an approach to business that valued practical wisdom alongside theoretical knowledge. I accepted the position. My first day back at Clearfield was surreal. The same office, the same view of the warehouses, but now with a title that gave me authority I had never had before. My first priority was assessing the full scope of the problems I was inheriting. The inventory situation was even worse than Richard had initially described. The $5 million in excess electronics and furniture was actually the conservative estimate. The total value of slow-moving inventory was closer to $7 million when depreciation and carrying costs were factored in. Meanwhile, stockouts on essential items had expanded beyond what I had seen in the initial reports. My first executive decision was to immediately implement an emergency restocking protocol for high turnover items, even if it meant paying premium prices for expedited orders. We needed to stop the bleeding from canceled contracts before we could address the excess inventory problem. My second decision was to restore the communication channels between warehouse managers and corporate purchasing. Ben Carter and his counterparts in other locations once again had direct input into forecasting decisions, and their real-time feedback became an essential component of our revised inventory management system. Emma Harper, who had endured 6 months of having her expertise dismissed, was promoted to Assistant Director of Operations. Her institutional knowledge and understanding of client needs made her invaluable in the rebuilding process. The excess inventory problem required more creative solutions. Rather than simply writing off millions in losses, we developed partnerships with discount retailers and outlet stores to move the electronics and furniture at reduced margins. It was a financial hit, but it was better than letting the inventory sit indefinitely while accruing carrying costs. Lucas, I learned through industry contacts, had moved on to a consulting position with another distribution company, where he was once again advocating for social media-driven forecasting methodologies. I hoped his new employer would be more successful at integrating his theories with practical operational realities. Within 4 months, Clearfield's inventory levels had stabilized, customer satisfaction scores began improving as stockouts decreased, and several major clients who had threatened to leave renewed their contracts. The financial impact of Lucas's decisions would take longer to fully recover from, but the operational crisis had been resolved. Looking back on the experience, I realized that the real lesson wasn't about the superiority of traditional methods over modern ones, but about the importance of understanding the difference between genuine innovation and change for its own sake. Social media analytics and algorithmic forecasting aren't inherently wrong. They might genuinely be valuable tools when properly integrated with operational knowledge and market understanding. The problem with Lucas's approach wasn't that it was new, but that it was implemented without consideration for proven principles of supply chain management. He had dismissed 15 years of successful forecasting, not because it was demonstrably inferior, but because it didn't align with contemporary business school theories about digital transformation and data-driven decision-making. As I settled into my new role, I began exploring ways to incorporate some of the technological tools Lucas had advocated for, but as supplements to rather than replacements for the foundational methods that had proven successful over time. The goal wasn't to resist change, but to ensure that change was driven by actual improvement rather than theoretical appeal. 6 months after returning to Clearfield, I received a call from a former colleague at another distribution company. They were experiencing their own forecasting challenges and wondered if I might be interested in consulting on their inventory management systems. It was a reminder that the problems Clearfield had faced weren't unique across the industry. Companies were struggling to balance innovation with operational effectiveness. The experience had taught me that expertise isn't obsolete, but it does need to be defended and articulated. In a business environment that often values novelty over effectiveness, it's easy for proven methods to be dismissed simply because they aren't new. The challenge isn't to resist all change, but to ensure that change is based on genuine improvement rather than fashionable theories. As I looked out at the warehouses that were once again operating at optimal efficiency, I thought about Anna and how proud she would have been to see this vindication of the work that had meant so much to me. The forecasting models I had developed weren't just spreadsheets. They were representations of everything I had learned about the delicate balance between supply and demand that keeps businesses profitable. In the end, the numbers had spoken their truth. $5 million in excess inventory and $2 million in lost sales had provided an expensive but definitive test of competing methodologies. Sometimes the most sophisticated approach is simply to pay attention to what actually works, even if it doesn't come with impressive credentials or contemporary buzzwords. The story of my firing and return had become something of a legend within the company, though I tried not to encourage too much discussion about it. The important thing wasn't that I had been vindicated, but that Clearfield had learned valuable lessons about the difference between genuine innovation and change for its own sake. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I walked past the warehouses one more time. The inventory levels were balanced, the operational flow was smooth, and the numbers on my forecasting reports matched the reality on the warehouse floor. It was exactly as it should be, unremarkable in its efficiency, invisible in its success. That, I realized, was perhaps the highest compliment any forecasting system could receive, to work so well that no one had to think about it, to be so accurate that its predictions became simply the expected reality. After 15 years of building that system, 6 months of watching it be dismantled, and 4 months of rebuilding it again, I finally understood that some things truly cannot be replaced by trendy theories or unproven assumptions. In the end, the numbers always tell the truth.